Question 4, we have a bell-shaped distribution that represents the time taken to learn the basics of something by students. So the average time students take to learn this thing is 200 minutes, and the standard deviation of this distribution is 20 minutes. And what this question wants us to figure out in part A is to find the approximate percentage of students who take between 160 to 240 minutes to learn this word processor. So we have a bell-shaped curve, and we want to figure out the percentage of data points in some interval. So that tells me that I want to use the empirical rule. And what does the empirical rule say? Well, it says three things. The empirical rule says that 68% of data points or observations lie within one standard deviation. I'm going to abbreviate here, of the mean. So 68% of data is within one standard deviation of the mean. 95% of data points lie within two standard deviations of the mean. And then last, 99.7% of data points lie within three standard deviations of the mean. So I have my numbers here. 68% of data is within one standard deviation, 95% is within two, and 99.7 is within three. These are numbers that you'll want to remember. So let's put that into the context of our problem. So we know that we have a bell-shaped curve, so I've drawn it already. And we know that the average of our distribution, the mean, is 200 minutes. So I'll put 200 here in the middle. And we know that one standard deviation for this distribution is 20. So I can draw my intervals. So one standard deviation within the mean is this interval, 20 above the mean, and 20 below the mean. Two standard deviations away from the mean is 2 times 20 plus 200, so 240, or 2 times 20 subtracted from 200, which is 160. And then three standard deviations will be 260 and 140. So what the empirical rule tells me is that within one standard deviation, so 20 below the mean and between 20 below the mean and 20 above the mean, within this interval that I'm going to shade in light blue here, this tells me that 68% of my data points lie within this interval from 180 to 220. And then similarly, this interval from 160 to 240 within two standard deviations. In this interval, I know that I have 95% of my data points. And similarly, from 140 to 260, that's three standard deviations below to three standard deviations above the mean. In this interval is 99.7% of my data. So that's how we use the empirical rule in this problem. So let's now use it to answer part 1. So we want to know how many students, what percentage of students lie within this interval from 160 to 240. Well, this is simply a direct application of the empirical rule. This interval, 160, I've shaded that in. So 160 is equal to the mean minus 2 standard deviations. And then 240 is the mean plus 2 standard deviations. And the empirical rule tells me that 95% of my data is within this interval. So for part 1, this is 95%. Next, for part 2, we want to figure out what percentage of students took less than 180 minutes to learn this. So this takes a little more calculation, but we're still going to be using the empirical rule. So let me draw up my intervals. So I know that from 180 to 220, this is 68%. From 160, oops, I'll use a different color. From 160 to 240, this is 95%. Actually, I don't need this part. So, okay. I know that what I want less than 180 is precisely this shaded area right here. Everything to the left of 180. That represents all numbers less than 180. Now, I know that everything in this area from 180 to 220 is 68% of my data. So if I know that 68% is this unshaded area in the middle, then in these two shaded areas together, I must have 100% minus 68%. So 100 minus 68% is 32%. So I know that this section here plus this section here must add up to 32%. I only want what's in this area. So I know gray plus blue equals 32%. The second thing I know is that the bell curve is symmetrical. These two sections are proportionally the same. This is everything below a standard deviation from the mean. This is everything above a standard deviation from the mean. So I know that this gray section must have the same percentage of students as the blue section. So now I know that these two sections are the same and they add up to 32%. So therefore, the percentage of students who take less than 180 minutes must be equal to half of 32%, which is 16%. Last, part B asks, what's the interval that contains the time taken by 68% of students? Well, this is simply a direct application of the empirical rule. The empirical rule tells me that 68% of data points, that's everything within one standard deviation of the mean, which we identified was this interval right here, from 180 to 220. So the interval that contains 68% of students is the interval from 180 to 220. In other words, the mean minus one standard deviation to the mean plus one standard deviation.